Hi, my name is Elsa Apernix. I'm a grad student in Spanish 5015, and today I'm going to be talking about stigmatization of different dialects of Spanish, specifically Galician, Andalusian, and Latin American Spanish. So to start off, I want to talk a little bit about why does a language change. So when we think about why a language changes, it's oftentimes in regards to being a new way of expressing something. So this isn't necessarily a bad thing that happens, but it's natural change that happens throughout the course of history. When we think about why language does change, there are usually specific reasons for why it does. So when we're thinking about those new ways of expressing something, we're thinking about new innovations, specifically lexical innovations, morphological innovations, syntactic innovations, semantic change, and phonetic change. So when we think about what are those principles of change, they're automatically going to compete with our existing language structures. So we've got these principles of change that we have from David Ferries in his book, A Brief History of the Spanish Language. And these principles of change are: variation is an intrinsic characteristic of language. Social groups use linguistic variance to mark their identity within a speech community, and variance spread gradually through lexicon and speech community. And the principle of change that I'm going to be concentrating on most when I think about stigmatization of dialects is that second principle of change, specifically the one where social groups use linguistic variance to mark their identity within a speech community. And this all comes down to the big theme that we have is perceived prestige. So how is prestige seen when someone is using a specific dialect? And what kind of prestige and social change can be seen from whatever dialect someone is using? So I want to get a little bit into what my three dialects are that we're going to be talking about today. The first one is Galician, and so this is from Galicia in Spain, where we see a lot with speakers that speak this dialect is that they're struggling with their identity of who they are as a Spanish speaker. So when we think about that, we're getting a diglossic situation. So this goes back in history, back to the beginning of the 19th century, and when we're thinking about the formation of the early Spanish state. So when we go back to history, when we think about this original use of this dialect, it originally was then thought to be inappropriate for educational and high culture uses. So when a speaker needed to use a more formal language, they weren't going to go and use their Galician, they were just going to use their traditional Castilian Spanish. So after that, it was automatically relegated to pretty much just an oral use. It wasn't really being taught anymore because of that diglossic situation and the perceived prestige that someone could get from using this specific dialect. When it got relegated to this oral use, it became associated with the very factors that put it into that use, specifically isolation, illiteracy, rurality, and poverty. So automatically when this dialect is labeled as someone who speaks it is isolated or illiterate or from a rural community or living in poverty, even if these weren't true, they were stigmatized because of those specific characteristics. And again, this goes back to our perceived prestige. So when someone is speaking this specific dialect of Spanish, what kind of prestige, what kind of social status are they going to be getting from using this specific dialect? And when they're being associated as someone that's illiterate, their perceived prestige goes way down and they're not gaining that social change. So therefore, we get that diglossic situation. This isn't necessarily a bad thing, having a diglossic situation. However, when we continue to have that diglossic situation and when this isn't being taught in educational settings anymore, it's not going to be carried on through future generations, and there gets to be a real danger of this specific dialect dying out. Moving on to Latin American Spanish, I'm going to be concentrating principally in the Caribbean regions, Puerto Rico, and the Dominican Republic. And so when we're thinking about these specific regions, we're thinking about the specific phonological variations that we see in the Spanish-speaking community here. So I have a couple of examples that we're going to be talking about here. The first of which being the loss of the coda S. So when we have that loss of the coda S, this leads to an overcorrection with speakers. So it ends up having speakers overcorrect what they perceive to be their incorrect way of speaking. And therefore, it ends up being stigmatized and often imitated in popular culture, which again, just carries on that stigma throughout the community. This is oftentimes referred to as hablar fisno, adding an S into hablar fino, or speaking fancy. So when speakers are labeled as speaking fancy, this leads to that stigma of saying someone is trying to move out of their current social situation, but they're ending up with these stigmatized phonological variations. The second phonological variation that I want to talk about here is the lateralization of the phrase final R, realizing it as an L. So an example of this would be something like comer being pronounced as comel, or mujer being pronounced as mujer. So again, this is oftentimes imitated in popular culture, leading to that stigma, and again, bringing down someone's perceived prestige. So when some sort of phonological variation is imitated in popular culture, it's not being imitated in a way that's being admired. It's being imitated as something that leads to a stigma and leads to someone moving away from the way that they're originally speaking their original dialect, and this can lead to specific dialects dying out again, which is kind of our overall theme here. The last dialect that I want to talk about today is Andalusian. So this is in the Andalusia region of Spain. And the example that I talk about in my paper that I am submitting along with this is a case study that was done with 15 Andalusian speakers who pretty universally are grappling with the stigma that their specific dialect of Spanish is carrying. So oftentimes, Andalusian is considered the deviation from the correct language being Castilian Spanish. So when it's labeled as deviation, again, this goes back to our perceived prestige. So if someone is labeled as a deviation, or the other words that are used in our specific case study that we're looking at is they're being labeled as other, which automatically puts someone in a different group from the original group of Castilian Spanish speakers, and they're not getting that perceived prestige that they're hoping to, that someone hopes to get from their dialect. So again, pretty much with all of our examples that we went through here, our perceived prestige, when a language is being stigmatized, the perceived prestige is something that really affects someone's place in society. And as people move away from their identity of speaking Galician, or moving away from or overcorrecting different dialects of Latin American Spanish, or grappling with the stigma of their identity with speaking Andalusian, this can lead to specific dialects dying out, and languages are dying at a very alarming rate. So with these stigmatized languages, there isn't an easy answer for how to stop a stigma of a language. However, the biggest thing is that obviously every single dialect has differences. There's similarities and there's differences, even if it's a specific dialect that maybe comes from the whole umbrella of Castilian Spanish or Latin American Spanish. But if these dialects continue to be stigmatized and imitated in popular culture, this can lead to the languages and the dialects dying out and not being continued on into further generations. Thank you so much for watching today, and have a great rest of your day.